Welcome back to Sunday Life. It's great to have you all here today. We're going to be looking at a parable, the parable of the lowest seat at the wedding in this episode. We're going to look at Luke chapter 14, but we're going to go through this chapter in about three different sections because there's three different stories here that one leads into the parable and one leads out of the parable. The parable's in the middle, kind of like two pieces of bread and the meat in the middle. When we look at the meaning of parables that Jesus told his disciples and told his audience, we have to recognize that his audience thought differently than we do. It's Eastern culture versus Western culture, the first century world versus the 21st century world. In the West, we think as individuals, but in the East, they think as a group. We think of personal success or personal achievement, and they think of group success and group achievement. We think of what's good for me, they think of what's good for us. We think of independence, they think of interdependence. We think of ourselves as unique individuals, and they think of themselves as conforming to the whole. In these stories that we're going to go through tonight, we'll see the Eastern mindset at work. To the Western mindset, it seems strange because we don't see the world in the same way as they do. As we go through these passages, I want you to try to put yourself in the Eastern way of thinking, the New York kind of mind, right? The Eastern way of thinking. It's also important to remember that the sensibilities of grace and mercy and empathy, equality, and human rights were not part of the emotional thought process in the first century. At the time of Christ, Jews were merciless towards sinners and Gentiles. In fact, every nation was merciless towards religious outcasts and foreigners. And beyond what was normal at the time of being merciless, the Romans elevated their levels of cruelty and disdain toward non-Romans. Aristotle described what the Roman world was like when he said, "The slave is no different from a living tool, and what consideration can a tool receive?" In the first century, people were seen as property. A person was a thing to be used and thrown away. In the Roman world, slaves, the old, the young, women, and the diseased were considered expendable. An unwanted child was thrown out, especially a girl child. Plato wrote that a weak or sickly child must be discarded. The value of life in the first century was starkly different from today. But the reason it is different today is because of Jesus Christ. Without Jesus, without his teaching, his example, and his sacrifice, this world would have continued seeing people as property instead of as human beings. Now, understand that in the passages we're going to read, the concepts that Jesus presents here are revolutionary and shocking to those hearing them and seeing his actions, hearing what he's saying. Just like we're shocked today by the changing mindset we see and we hear around us, those listening to Jesus had a similar reaction to his groundbreaking ideas. His words and actions were overturning their world. So now we're going to look at this simple afternoon luncheon that Luke wrote about, and we'll see three things that Jesus said and did that would change the world forever. We come to the setting up to the parable in Luke chapter 14, verses 1 through 6. It says, "On the Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched." Now, it's important for us to remember that not everyone in Israel went to synagogue or practiced the Sabbath. The religious habits of people then wasn't much different from us today. Not everyone goes to church and treats Sunday any different from other days. The same was true then. But Jesus is associating here with religious people, the Pharisees and the lawyers. It was common for those who did attend synagogue to have a Sabbath meal afterwards. It's like going out to lunch after Sunday morning church service. Jesus accepted the invitation to the Sabbath meal at the house of a prominent Pharisee. The statement that Jesus was being carefully watched is intentional by Luke. He says this because of the next statement, which says, "There in front of him was a man suffering from abnormal swelling of his body." So when Jesus gets to the Pharisee's house, there in front of him, in front of the house, is a man who has an abnormal swelling of his body. Other translations identify this illness as dropsy. Dropsy is a condition where the body swells due to heart, liver, or kidney failure, or it can be a symptom of malnutrition. This man wasn't there by accident. This was a setup. To the Pharisees, this person would never be in their home. That's why he was in front of the home. As I said previously, this man would be an outcast because he was sick. They wouldn't have this sinner in their home. And a lot of times they thought that someone who was sick because they were a sinner. But they would use him as a tool to set a trap for Jesus. Just to understand the background and the status at this time, the term Pharisee comes from an Aramaic word meaning to separate. The Pharisees kept themselves separated from the general public. The status of the public was that they were sinners, and the status of the Pharisees was that they were the righteous. Pharisees were devout religious followers of the Torah, and they kept themselves separate within society. Now, there was another group called the Essenes, who were devout mystic followers of the Torah, but they kept themselves separate outside of society. They even separated themselves from the Pharisees. And as we've talked before, there are the Sadducees. The Sadducees were wealthy priests who were both moderate and far left-wing politicians. And then there were the Zealots. They were far right-wing politicians seeking to overthrow Rome, very similar to what we see today. And then the final status group was the general public, which was everybody else, the normal first century people living their everyday lives. Now, this status system was initiated in Israel when Jewish captives returned to the land around 510 BC from Babylon. The land was inhabited by people from the surrounding countries. To the returning Jews, these people were pagan idolaters. Some Jews believed they needed to be separate from these people, and the status system was developed and maintained to maintain this separation. Over time, it became even more segregated. Now, going back to our passage, Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts of the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So Jesus wasn't surprised by the trap. He was used to the tactics of the Pharisees, and without hesitation, he asked the question directly to the lawyers, who should know the answer, whether healing on the Sabbath is permitted. But they kept quiet. They kept quiet because they knew that if they said it was lawful to do good on the Sabbath, they couldn't accuse him of breaking the Sabbath. And Jesus continues, or the passage continues, so taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him on his way. So Jesus actually placed his hands on this man to heal him. He took hold of him. Now, this would have stunned the Pharisees. They considered the diseased man to be unclean, and they would have had to gone through a cleaning ritual that if they touched the man, they had to clean themselves and go through this whole washing process. And after the man was healed, Jesus sent him away, which shows that he knew that the man wasn't there for the Sabbath meal, only there as a tool to test him. The passage continues, then he asked them, "If one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out?" And they had nothing to say. Again, they said nothing. So children were the same as animals. They were property. The question that Jesus is asking shows that even though that they would break their religious laws to recover their own property. Again, they didn't answer Jesus because they would all protect their property in spite of the religious teachings. Sometimes what's right or wrong can be complicated. Jesus healing the man on the Sabbath was an act of compassion. Therefore, compassion overcomes any religious contradictions or any religious conformity. When we're confused about how to respond in questionable religious situations, ask yourself, what is the compassionate thing to do? God desires us to be compassionate towards others rather than religious. Jesus came to lift oppression and set people free, not restrict them more and enslave them to more rituals and laws. And like these Pharisees showed by keeping silent when questioned by Jesus, there's no spiritual argument against compassion. Even religious sensibilities would be offended. Compassion was an alien concept in the first century, not something that they were used to. So this was the setup, the section, the passage. Luke used this to set up the parable of the lowest seat at the wedding. In Luke chapter 14, verses 1 through 7, we have the parable. And it says, when he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them a parable. So this parable starts with the statement that Jesus observed how the guests, meaning the Pharisees and the lawyers, were picking their seats at the table. Now, this parable is directed at them because of their actions. And it's interesting that previously, when we read the first passage, that Luke said the Pharisees and lawyers were watching Jesus. And here he says Jesus was watching them at the same time. Now, we all want to feel important. It's human nature. There's nothing wrong with a healthy self-esteem. But can we have too much self-esteem? Can we think too highly of ourselves? We definitely know it's possible, and we've seen that sentiment in action. What's critical about self-esteem is where it comes from. Is it based in reality? Do we seek self-esteem from others, or from ourselves, or from God? The Pharisees and lawyers sought importance and recognition from themselves and from men, not from God. The parable continues, when someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. So at this time, a wedding was the most important event in Jewish life. The seating at a wedding indicated your standing in the community. So it was important for them to get a great seat at the wedding. Big event. The parable continues. Jesus says, if so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this person your seat. Then humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. Now, this person that's being asked to change seats is basing his worth on the man asking him to take a lower seat. Therefore, he's feeling humiliated. Western culture is based on the concept of innocence and guilt, what we call the rule of law. But the rest of the world is based on the concept of honor and shame. Proverbs 3:35 says, the wise inherit honor, but fools get only shame. The humiliation of being called out in front of the community and told to take a lesser seat would be devastating, almost more than someone might be able to overcome. How can this humiliation be avoided? Well, Jesus tells them, but when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up to a better place. Then you'll be honored in the presence of all the other guests. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Now, this is the lesson of the parable. Those who exalt themselves in pride will be dishonored or humiliated, but those who humble themselves or are more modest in their self-assessment will be honored. Those who elevate themselves above others will be lowered, and those who lower themselves for the sake of others will be lifted. The first will be last, and the last will be first. We've heard this. This concept of humility towards others was earth shattering to the Jew and the Roman. It's even earth shattering to the Western culture today. Self promotion is our way of life. If we don't promote, if you don't promote yourself and you don't get noticed, after all, what is the point of social media? Everyone wants to be noticed. If you're not noticed, then who are you? If you're not noticed at work, then how are you going to get promoted? But promoted by who? By people or by God? Which is more important to you? God honors those who honor others before themselves. As Jesus says here, we control whether we have humility or pride. We promote ourselves above others, or we can humble ourselves among others. We control it. And then finally, Jesus comes to the trifecta of his lessons in this passage to the Pharisees and the lawyers in Luke chapter 14, verses 12 through 14. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or sisters, your relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you will be repaid." Reciprocity was a part of the culture in the first century. A main reason for having a luncheon or dinner was to get invited to a luncheon or dinner in return. This is what the way that they found recognition from others and from their community. It also made others indebted to them because they invited them, so they were going to indebted to invite them back. Reciprocity is the exchange of things with others for mutual benefit. Jesus was warning the host to check his motive for inviting only his family and friends. Is the motive for having a dinner the expectations of a return invitation? If that's your motive, then enjoy the momentary satisfaction. But Jesus shows his host a better motive for having a luncheon or dinner. He says, "But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed." So Jesus says our motive for inviting guests to a party should be selfless generosity. If we invite those who can't repay us, then God will repay us. In Luke chapter 6, verses 34 through 35, it says, "And if you lend to those from whom you expect repayment, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners, expecting to be repaid in full. But love your enemies, do good to them, and lend to them without expecting to get anything back. Then your reward will be great, and you will be the children of the Most High, because he is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked." Now, Jesus isn't saying that your family and friends can't be invited. You can invite them, but also invite those who have needs that can't repay you. God isn't only kind to the ungrateful and the wicked, he's also kind to the grateful and the faithful. There's a verse that says that God causes the sun to shine on the just and the unjust, and he causes the rain to fall on the good and the evil. God treats everyone the same. God entertains both good and evil, those with needs and those who need nothing. And Jesus continues, "Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." God honors selfless generosity. This blessing will come directly from God at the resurrection of the righteous. As we've discussed in the previous episodes, there are two resurrections. The first one is the resurrection of those who believe in Jesus Christ, counted as righteous. And the second is the resurrection of the unrighteous, or everyone else. At the resurrection of the righteous, those who are motivated by selfless generosity will receive a reward from God. Now, do you know any poor? Do you know any crippled? Do you know any lame and blind people? Who can you show selfless generosity to? The poor can be that odd social person. The crippled can be that insecure and lonely person, crippled emotionally. The lame can be that troubled person, right? Trying to get through life and they have troubles that they can't overcome. And the blind can be that person considered by others to be outside the norms, not seen by others, can't see others, not around others, blind to the world blind to them. Do you know anyone like these people? If so, then show them selfless generosity, regardless of what your religious relatives and friends think of you or of them, and God will reward you. We're invited to an eternal banquet, the marriage supper of the Lamb, with God and with his Son. We're poor, we're crippled, we're lame, we're blind, and we have nothing to give God or his Son for the compassion, the humility, and the selfless generosity that they've shown towards us. The three things that Jesus said and did at this Sabbath day meal that changed our world forever is that he showed compassion to the sick. He embodied humility to the proud, and he exemplified selfless generosity to those in need. Now, we should go and do as Jesus did. Now, how can we follow his example? Glad you asked. In the next episode, we're going to take a deep dive into what compassion is and what compassion isn't in today's world. Then the following weeks, we'll look at humility and then selfless generosity. Remember that in the first century, these things, this compassion, humility, selfless generosity was not part of what people even thought about or considered towards anyone. And it is in our world today because of Jesus Christ, because he came, because he exemplified these things to us. And through the preaching of his gospel, those empathies came into our world so that we could show that compassion, show the humility, and show generosity towards others in our world. Without Christ, our world would be a nightmare. So until our next episode, look around you. Look for opportunities to show compassion, humility, and selfless generosity to others. May God bless you and walk in Christ and your faith in his word. Thank you.